All right, good evening. I'm Faye D'Souza. Thank you for joining us. This is another very important open talk. Remember, we just read about what open talk is. The idea is to bring in collaborative minds and to tackle that question we've been asking for so long. Why is it India as a country able to get a handle on crimes of a sexual nature? Every time there's something big that happens that hits the headlines, we're suddenly very angry as a country. There's a lot of, in fact, bloodlust that happens in our country. And then we forget about it. A lot of the really important work, like police reforms, like sensitization of our police, is not done by government. Instead, big announcements are made by politicians, and then everybody forgets about it. But as women in this country who have to constantly live with the fear of rape, we have to ask the question of what we're doing wrong and what we can do better in order to solve that problem. Now, we began last week, and this is our second conversation, and it's a very interesting conversation. So I welcome all of you who've joined us for this conversation. Remember, you can leave your questions in the Q&A window or the chat window of this webinar, and we'll try and tackle those questions with our panelists as well. Let me do a quick introduction of our panel for a question of why men rape. Tara Kaushal is our first panelist, and quite aptly because Tara has just released a book called Why Men Rape, an Indian Undercover Investigation. Now, she's a writer and a media consultant. She lives in Mumbai, and her book was released 2 days ago. And I know personally that Tara has been working on this book for at least 3 years. She's traveled the country. She's interviewed many, many people. She's gone inside of jails and spoken to those people who were convicted of rape as to why they did it. Perhaps a question that has plagued and worried so many of us. So I'm very curious to know what she discovered during her research. My second panelist is Ashok GV. Ashok is a practicing lawyer before the High Court of Karnataka, and he's a partner at Factum Law in Bangalore. But other than being a hotshot lawyer, Ashok also does a lot of pro bono work when it comes to crimes of a sexual nature, helping the family and victims of sexual violence get justice. My third guest, and always one of my favorite guests, Mr. Vikram Singh, is an ex-IPS officer who served as DG Home Guards, Director General of Police in Uttar Pradesh. He's also right now a very fond teacher and a much-loved Chancellor of the Noida International University as well. He's been very kind to join us on this conversation. And we'll soon have Yogita Bayana join us as well. Yogita is an activist who works with the families of victims of and survivors of sexual crime. And she's been among the strongest voices, strongest protesters for women's rights in our country. And so she really knows what goes wrong during the processing of rape and other such crimes on the ground, and how much of the law is actually really, really followed. So this is our panel for this evening, and I welcome the participants and the panel for being kind enough to give us your time. But I'm going to go through this panel one by one. We'll make opening statements. We get opening statements from each of them, and then we can work into comments. So the floor I'm going to hand over to Tara Kaushal first. Tara, good evening and congratulations on the book. I know you worked very hard and very long on this topic. And maybe at some point we'll have a conversation on why you chose this topic at all. But I know that the audience is as curious as me as to what you found. Is there one answer, Tara, to the question of why do men rape?
No, Faye, there isn't one answer. I think there were a lot of things that I discovered when, considering I've been studying and writing about gender violence for so long, there were a lot of things that I discovered on the ground that were very different than what I imagined. But I do know, if you're asking me if there's one clear answer, and we always come back to stock statements like power and patriarchy, but there isn't a clear answer, Faye. No, there isn't.
So what were the answers you discovered, Tara?
So what I would say is, and this is slightly different than what we've been learning all along. I'd say rape, it's hard to come down to a couple of answers, but I'd say rape happens for two reasons. One is that the perpetrator objectifies the victim, and this is what we're always hearing, right? We talk about the objectification and hypersexualizing of women in films and in the media and in general. So what happens then is when a man is in a relationship, or even if he loves the woman, he's able to take a step back and say, if it's a choice between my desires and her desires, my desires are more important. So, even if you look at it from the Nicholas Groth typology that says, power, anger, and sex are the three reasons for rape. When you look at it like this is where your sexuality comes into place, right? You're interested in sex. You're not angry with the person that you're doing this to, but you are entitled, and that boils down to patriarchy. The other, and a newer theory of violence, which has recently been applied to gender violence, is that the perpetrator doesn't actually objectify the victim and sees them as fully human. And that's when you come down to power and, when they want to assert power and inflict pain on a human being. If you actually objectified them and didn't see them as human, you wouldn't bother hurting them, right? So this is a newer theory, and it's an interesting way of looking at violence. It's very, very new and only recently applied to gender violence. And this boils down to the rage and violence within the perpetrator. And it also explains a lot of rape at the time of war and in a space of caste and other, religious conflict and other conflict. And when you watch, rape videos and you see women trying to fight back, and I've had the unfortunate task of watching these videos as well to kind of see what the emotions are. You kind of see that it is a lot about enjoying the pain that you're inflicting. And if you didn't feel that the person was feeling pain, you wouldn't bother inflicting it. So yeah, two ways to look at violence. Either the perpetrator sees the victim as not human, as an object, and that comes down to patriarchy, or they see this victim as fully human, and that comes down to the rage that lays within the perpetrator. So,
Tara, quick question, if I may. The title of your book says very clearly that it is an Indian investigation, which I thought was interesting. Right. Is there, from the answers you've given us, is there a cultural difference to to rape in India vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
Most certainly. I mean, when you look at power or patriarchy or any of these stock phrases, as I told you, universality is different from uniformity. So it's pretty much like saying, when you look at why Germans, for instance, are vegetarian, they'll be vegetarian for different reasons than in India. So you have to not, in order to not paint with too broad a brush, I had to go and look at India and what was happening here. And it's a vast enough country with enough complexities to justify me saying that there are cultural slants to this. We're still transitioning from being, women are still transitioning from being possessions to people. And in that, there's a very fraught gender dynamic that one has to address in the country.
And one more quick question, Tara, before we move on to the rest of the panelists. I do know, and I remember having this conversation with you some time ago, where you said you had actually traveled to jails, you had gone inside of jails, you had met those convicted of crimes who had accepted to you that, yes, we did this. Would you give us an instance of what that was like, or some of the answers that you received when you interviewed these?
So I did interview a few men in jail, and of course their insights have come into the book. But the 9 subjects that I looked at primarily were not in jail, because I feel, for several reasons, I feel that men who are not, nobody is an island. So a lot of the ethnological reasons and cultural reasons cannot be seen from within a jail. Also, we know that a disproportionate number of men in jail are lower caste and Muslims, and this is well documented. So for me, I didn't want to, forward the idea that you have the Shakti Kapoorite rapists or the other types of men who hang out behind bushes and wait for some virgin upper caste girl to come along. So I have looked at men across social strata, and some of them, out of the 9 men that I spent time with, 5 of them admitted to committing rape, and a lot of it was because they didn't understand what they were talking of was actually rape. Like especially when it came to marital relationships, a lot of their conversation, telling me that they were forcing their wives, and it was, to me, clearly rape, but for them these were the norms. And a lot of it was rape that was par for the course in their lives. And of course there were the stranger rapes and what they call shaitani and chedna and troubling women on the street. But that was aside. As we know, 95% of victims know their perpetrators. So to position, them as strangers on the street just waiting to pounce on you was not an agenda that I had.
Would you be able to tell us of one of these instances, or is it all just for the book?
No. I'm just wondering which one is most interesting. One of them, I think the one that I was actually happy to hear that he's in jail now, is this man who was a political henchman in Bhopal. And he had an indiscriminate sexuality and an indiscriminate trail of sexual violence. And a lot of it was, women. When I asked him, what do you think balatkar is? And he said, balatkar hota bhi hai, ye bhi nahi janta. I don't even believe rape exists. Rape only happens when people find out. So according to him, women had an indiscriminate sexuality. And the only reason they said no to men was because of social conditioning. And that, for a woman, because she had capacity, and this is an English word he used, because she had a capacity to have sex multiple times, it didn't really matter whether it was one man 5 times or multiple men, which is why he was happy to admit to gang rapes and all sorts of stuff. He's in jail now, but not for a sexual crime. He's a political henchman, and he ended up in jail for a political crime. But I don't see this man as redeemable, so I'm just glad he's off the street. Um, yeah, that was a difficult one.
So we'll come back to Tara's insights and the book that she has written. And if anyone has questions for her, please feel free to pop them into either Q&A section at this webinar or the chat window. But I want to bring in Ashok as well. Ashok GV, like I told you, is a hotshot lawyer who also does a lot of very interesting pro bono work. Ashok, we've had these conversations as well about criminology and what we've learned and how difficult it is to sort of understand. In order to fully remedy the problem, we need to understand why it happens. And specifically to do with rape, like Tara pointed out, there have been several theories about whether it is about power, whether it is about inflicting pain, or whether it's simply about sexual gratification. What has your research told you so far, Ashok?
So I think the experience that we have had working with both law enforcement and victims, the first thing that comes to my mind is that in India, we don't know what we don't know. So if I have to really sit down and understand what drives our thinking towards fighting rape, I think a lot of it is based on anecdotal evidence. A lot of it is based on stereotypes. A lot of it is based on prejudices. So there has never been an effort to make a scientific inquiry into why people in India actually commit sexual assault. Now, one of the interesting features, if I take it as an example, is how we always look at blaming the attire of the victim as one of the precipitating factors. But I read a very interesting opinion piece by an Egyptian writer, Ala Al-Aswani, in I think it was in June 2014, where he said that dress code as a concept in Egypt was almost unheard of until the 80s or the 90s. And when they actually tried to reflect on what is the incidence of sexual aggression after the dress code was introduced for women, in 2008, they found out that 83% of women, as opposed to pre-1990 era, actually complained of sexual harassment. And for 46% of those women, it was a day-to-day experience, which means bringing in a dress code for women as a social prescription actually caused an increase in sexual aggression as opposed to de-escalating it. So to my mind, I think a lot of our victim blaming stereotypes, saying that women shouldn't venture out in the night, they shouldn't wear a certain kind of attire, it is first and foremost so unscientific because we have never truly tried to make an understanding of why these crimes happen, how these crimes occur, what are the percentages of crimes of this nature that occur during the nighttime, during the daytime. And I think one place where the West has done really well is that they have actually probed these questions from a very scientific perspective. So be it the works of Nicholas Groth or FBI profilers like John Douglas or Roy Hazelwood, they have actually sat down to understand victimology, they have sat down to understand offender behavior, and they have classified behavior in sexual assault into different categories of rapists, based on which practical tools for law enforcement has been developed. And I think that's one of the main reasons why our fight against rape is going bad, because we simply don't understand the enemy that we are fighting.
So is there any insight in India right now, Ashok, as to the enemy that we are fighting?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, as an example, if I have to just go back to the documentary, India's Daughter, and as a person deeply ingrained in this field, for me, it was when the documentary came out, it was actually an exciting opportunity to truly hear from the mouth of the rapist himself as to what were the motives, what were the backgrounds. And as history shows, the moment the documentary was released, it became such a spectacle that it got banned as quickly as it came out. So, and one of the other problems is that the moment we make a mention that let's sit down and understand these people and why they commit these crimes, the immediate answer is these guys are monsters. What is the point of even trying to understand them? We are being insensitive to the victims. But as I always keep saying, as a lawyer, the first and foremost rule is to first listen to the opposing side and then strategize. So if you don't make an effort, I don't think we will know. So we are now largely left to depend upon Western studies to understand why crimes in India of this nature are occurring. And except for initiatives like Tara's initiative, there has been no effort from the point of law enforcement itself to truly understand this from a behavioral sciences perspective.
Also, Ashok, I know that you've taken a look and spent a lot of time researching the behavioral sciences data and the criminology data that comes from other parts of the world. Uh, is there an overwhelming sense, at least for you, that most of this doesn't apply because we're so culturally different in India? Because gender and sexuality is so culturally different in India.
Well, not exactly. So, for example, just to give a brief insight as to how the West approaches it, uh, within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, two different profilers have developed two different typologies. So, John Douglas classifies all categories: power reassurance rapist, the exploitative rapist, the anger rapist, and the sadistic rapist. Roy Hazelwood goes with the more simplistic classification of organized and unorganized. Now, if I look at the Nirbhaya gang rape case as a case study, it was a crime of opportunity because it was not that they set out looking for a rape victim. They set out to commit a crime. And when the opportunity presented itself in the form of a victim who was vulnerable, what started off as a spree to rob and to vandalize eventually culminated into a very brutal gang assault. So this would fit under the category of an exploitative rapist. And the quality of violence inflicted also seems to suggest that one or more members of the gang could have shown signs of being either sadistic rapists or anger rapists. And from the point of view of crimes committed against children, the typology that is used in the West is situational sex offenders and preferential sex offenders. This is by Special Agent Kenneth V. Lanning. And situational sex offenders are typically your incest offenders or people who are generally abusive and the abuse against the child is a pattern of that abuse. And preferential sex offenders is what we understand as a pedophile. And a lot of the crimes that we deal with seems to fit under one or more of these categories. But to truly understand the nuts and bolts of these classifications, I think for that, we have to truly sit down and really figure out why these crimes are occurring in India. For example, a caste-based crime, where a person is probably committing a crime against a lower caste person with the idea of asserting caste identity, it is a form of power reassurance rape as well. So I don't think the classifications are untrue for India, but even for us to test that hypothesis, we still need a very structured and a very scientific approach to testing the classification as to whether it works in India or not.
And Ashok, unfortunately, like you said, unlike, except for projects like Tara's new book, very little research has been done in India as to why rape does happen. So then if we look at the solutions that have been flung at us every time, other than perhaps, when the Nirbhaya case happened and the laws really changed, post that, every time there's a really gruesome POCSO case, which is sexual crime against a child, or every time there's a gruesome case of rape that affects the urban middle class in some way, there's outrage. And politicians make announcements of death penalties, and they make announcements of, we will do this and fast track courts and things like that. Nothing really changes on the ground. Do you also think that is because we don't really understand the problem in order to, know whether these solutions actually fit or not?
Absolutely. I mean, let's just take two examples, right? For example, I know a lot of people have been citing castration as one of these the punishments for a rapist. But in the book of Nicholas Groth, Men Who Rape: Psychology of the Offender, a specific chapter is dedicated to sexual dysfunction that the rapist experiences during the course of committing assault. And in one particular paragraph, he notes that 46% of the sex offenders actually complained of sexual dysfunction during the time of committing the assault itself. And in a lot of other cases, based on the works of John Douglas or Roy Hazelwood, what is also seen is that experiencing of sexual dysfunction, either impotence or retarded ejaculation or premature ejaculation, also causes aggravation of violence against the victim. So castration as a potential punishment may still not solve the problem because we're still operating on the misguided assumption that rape is about sex. But Groth says that rape is a pseudo-sexual act that serves non-sexual needs. So I think these stereotypes essentially fuel politicians to come back with very easy solutions, where they say we will take away life imprisonment and we will introduce the death penalty. But have we really tried to understand from the point of view of the rapist if a death penalty is even a deterrent or not? Because going by Tara's example of the political henchman in Madhya Pradesh, for him, the death penalty or the life imprisonment won't make a difference because fact of the matter is he's still not convicted of rape. He's convicted of a different crime altogether. So if the probability of him getting caught is as low because he enjoys that sense of power, then death penalty or castration will not mitigate the crime wave itself. So what we really need is to truly sit down and first and acknowledge that we do not know the crime wave or the crime patterns, and we need to listen to the likes of Tara more so that we develop an understanding of who these guys are and why they do what they do.
Well, I'll second that. We have to listen to Tara. It's not something I will argue with. I want to also bring in, Mr. Vikram Singh. Mr. Vikram Singh has headed investigation and investigative agencies for many, many years. Mr. Singh, I find this very interesting because if we haven't truly studied the nature of the crime, the motives behind the crime in India, isn't that crippling then for investigators? Because if you had access to criminology and data and the patterns of this sort of crime, won't it become easier for investigators and teams of investigators to be able to get to the bottom of cases like this?
Of course, Faye. It was such a pleasure. I was spellbound by the scholarly accounts of Ashok Ji and Tara Ji, and I was compliment Tara Ji for coming out with a masterpiece. And I'm sure it will do tremendous service in the course of investigation work as well. Very little work has been done in respect of the motivation and the motive behind rapes, because the police investigators primarily interested in collecting the evidence, filing the charge sheet, and if he's more serious, only prosecuting the case. And if the conviction is there, he gets the conviction. I think he is on cloud 9 on Mount Everest and his job is over. Getting behind the eyeballs of the rapist is one thing that the police department has seldom done in its existence of 150 years. But my experience has been that I have been very passionate in interrogating of rape accused. I have only passion for interrogating anti-national elements and terrorists and rapists, just to understand the psychosomatic changes and the psychosomatic reasons why a person does a thing what he is doing. And I feel that the mental fragility in most of the cases, as also the amorphous nature of their norms, their behavior, their upbringing, there are so many factors during the course, time, place, and circumstance. Rapes would be very different for different reasons in North India. Rapes would happen for very different in Central India. And rapes would happen for very, very different reasons in Southern India. You see, in India itself, which says lofty ideals but lowly conduct. And you had the disrobing of Draupadi for what? Just to prove in the good old pristine golden age of the Vedic age, Draupadi was disrobed for what? To prove a point and masculine superiority, and also that women are a part of your property and they can be exchanged and they can be disrobed only to prove a point that who is superior and who is inferior. But getting behind the eyeballs of the rapist, that is very one interesting point. Why does a man rape? There are multiple reasons. I would say I would profile rapists into 3 categories. One, who are below 25, those who are above 25 and say around 45. Then there are those who are around maybe 50 plus. And the last category and the most vicious is the senior citizens above 65. There is a special category of those, and you'd be shocked to know that there are babas, there are godmen who are die-hard perverts. And when I raided their hermitages and the ashrams, I was shocked to find out obscene literature, pornographic material, psychotropic substance, but that of course is a different story. But getting behind those below 25, they were hooked onto pornography. Rick Santorum of USA has said that watching pornography alters the mind in a one-way direction. It will never be normal again. And if a generation is fed, or a youth or an adolescent is fed on pornography week after week, month after month, it is difficult to rewire his mind back. And 30% of the rape accused I have interrogated were die-hard perverts, and they watched pornography, took to substance abuse, and then they committed the rape, as in the case of Hyderabad. And many other cases, I could go on and on. Then there are those elderly uncles and mamas and chachas who are very respectable, who are very honorable, very elderly, but when the opportunity comes, they are not the type to look back or even look at a second class. Rape as a crime changes complexion during the course of the commission. During the course of the commission itself, there are various shades of rape. What may perfectly start off as a perfect affair may ultimately end up during the course of making of the tea, it may actually turn out to be a horrific rape. Therefore, the whole horizon and the complexion of the sexual crime depends upon three factors: time, place, and circumstance. The mind of a rapist is the most complicated mind I have ever encountered. And if I were to say that it is not even second to the anti-national element terrorist also, I think it is difficult to pick up who is more perverse, who's more violent, and who's more complicated. I think the psychosomatic studies, I'm reminded of one quote of Carl Jung: the human mind does not oscillate between good and bad. It oscillates between sense and nonsense.
Well, some interesting points there that I would want our panelists to respond to. And we're getting a lot of questions as well. Mamta Jain says, if attire was the reason, then what is an infant to wear to avoid rape? Namrata Patil says, what is the reason that men rape their own daughters, or women who are their blood relations? And of course, incest is a massive problem that we have in our country. The fact that several times the perpetrator tends to be someone within the family or someone trusted by the family as well. Harish Sadani says, calling rape a psychosomatic illness, as said by many psychiatrists, is a simplistic way of looking at the issue, looking at the structural aspects of the issue related to patriarchy and masculinity. And we'll come back to that. But I do want both Ashok and Tara to respond to a couple of things. And this is something that's come up many times. And I'm curious to know if there's any sort of scientific research that backs it. Tara, the idea of pornography leading to a rise in rape, or leading to, as a leading cause of rape, is that something you discovered as well?
Yes, and it's really strange. It's funny, but there was a first wave of, when you looked at pornography, there was a wave of understanding that said, porn allows men to get it out of their systems. But the fact is, that was before porn is everywhere, on every phone, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all the time. Now, this to me is problematic, because if we do not have sex education or comprehensive sexuality education, and men are learning about the needs of women through pornography, particularly through rape videos, then where is an understanding of what consensual, healthy sex is supposed to be? Of course, there are lots of studies that say porn goes the other way, right? It doesn't help men get it out of their system. It changes the gender dynamic. It creates a world like sex work creates a world. It creates a world where women exist for the pleasures of men. So it ruins the gender dynamic in any case. I would be inclined to say that pornography is definitely a contributing factor from all I've read. And what I did with the book is I looked at all sorts of studies, and I saw how they intersected with the lives of the men that I studied. Having said that, one of the subjects that I studied was a doctor, and he's in his 50s. And this is difficult to even talk about, but he raped a friend of mine when she was 12 and has left her paraplegic. So this is a very personal story, but for him, the first time he encountered pornography was a Debonair magazine when he was in his 20s. So it's simplistic also to say that porn is the only factor, but one has to consider what the increase in pornography is doing to the psyches of men across the world, across the country, and particularly in the absence of sexuality education and a healthy dynamic in other ways. We're all exposed to multiple ways of being and ways of thinking. But if this is the primary and only way you understand sexuality and, a sexual relationship, then it's certainly a lot more problematic and difficult to deal with. It's got a lot of negatives that are exacerbated by by how underage people are looking at pornography every day, all the time.
Hmm. Ashok, there has been a call to ban pornography, and the truth is that it is remarkably accessible in India on smartphones at very low cost, almost zero cost. If it's only really the cost of the data. Do you agree that pornography or access to pornography, in the absence of other education, of consent, of safe sex, of just sex at all, is perhaps detrimental?
Well, I would just like to qualify. See, let's understand one thing. I think the moment we have a debate about why the crime wave in India has become as pervasive as it is, it is common to come across people saying that westernization is to blame, influx of pornography is to blame. But I always go back to the point that probably our great grandparents got married at the age of 8 or 9 and had their first children at the age of 11 or 12, and that is a case of child sexual abuse. So sexual violence is very deeply ingrained in the fundamentals of a society, right? And it existed long before internet pornography hit our screens or hit our internet. So the point that I would like to make, and again, these are largely untested hypotheses, but if I go purely by the works of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their research seems to suggest that pornography and sexual offenses have a correlative relationship, but not a causative relationship. So to roughly translated, what it means is pornography may not cause a person to commit rape, but it may mold the fantasy of what he wants to do during the course of sexual assault itself. So their work seems to suggest that even if you take pornography out of the equation, there will still be other motivating factors that may continue to precipitate the drive towards committing sexual assault. The other point that we need to understand is that the assumption that pornography incites a person's lust and then causes the person to commit rape still operates on the assumption that rape is about sex. And one of the curious things about Nicholas Groth's work is that there's a chapter dedicated to a section of the study where he documents that a significant majority of the offenders that he interviewed were in consensual sexual relationships when they were actually going out and committing these crimes, which means sexual gratification was not the primary motive. Now, that then calls into question the wisdom that pornography is causing rape, because pornography assumes that you're sexually aroused and then you commit rape. But if sex is not the primary motive, then is pornography really the one to blame? And the last point that I wish to make, Ted Bundy, who is one of the most prolific serial killers in the US, during one of his final interviews just before he was put to the death penalty, also came out and said that pornography is what caused him to commit these rapes. But the one thing that John Douglas always cautions about is that rapists are prone to not taking responsibility and to lying. So if given an opportunity to displace the entire blame onto something else, rather than actually taking responsibility for the choices they've made to victimize somebody else, they will find factors like pornography, bad childhood, 100 other reasons. But fact of the matter is that 80% of India's population is probably hooked on to pornography, and a very few of them actually commit these sexual assaults. So I think, again, like everything else, we really don't know what we don't know. So we will have to sit down and try and understand how relevant pornography is. In juvenile crimes, yes, definitely there is a strong correlation. But is it causative? I'm not fully convinced yet.
So I think that's a very candid acceptance that we don't know what we don't know. And unfortunately, it leaves so many people then working in the pitch dark. The investigators, the prosecutors, for example, those framing our laws, who, if we don't know what the motives are, we don't know why this happens, how do we go about, even attempting to prevent this? So a couple of more questions that have come in that I would like to take. One of this comes in from Vandana Suri, who says, Tara mentioned that most of the people in jails were from poorer communities or from religious minorities. Is this a fact? I feel as a woman, the risk is just men, irrespective of financial or religious situations. Is there maybe the poorer Muslim community are being arrested more than others? So this is a very, very interesting question. So it's actually a combination of how many people in fact do get arrested and how many people have the access to get them out of jail and who get bail hearings in their favor. Tara, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I love the question, of course, but if you look at most studies, you'll realize that it's not as though and that's the reason I didn't want to promote the Shakti Kapoor idea of a rapist. It's not as though men from the top classes of society don't rape. In fact, they have the most means and the most opportunity. If you look at crime as a combination of means, motive, and opportunity, they have the most means and the most opportunity. And you know, these are trusted men. And we saw that during Me Too, these are men that were exposed. And we clearly know that men from the highest classes of society are as dangerous predators as, you know, other men. In fact, I think they're more dangerous because they get away with crime a lot more. And so then you come back to the idea that when you look at men in jail, we know that a law enforcement system leans the hardest on people from the lower classes or lower economic backgrounds. So it's not as though men from the upper classes of society are not raping, they're just getting away with it. And I think that's one of the things that Me Too did. It united women across classes because there was this idea that, you know, such things don't happen to women like us in and are not done by men like ours, or, you know, like the men that we know. And Me Too exposed that across classes. This is a universal female experience. But yes, a disproportionate number of people in Indian jails, and these are studies that you can look up easily, a disproportionate number of people in Indian jails are poor and are Dalit and are Muslims. And perhaps I can find that study for you as well, if we connect later. But it is documented.
Yeah. So in fact, Vandana Suri reacts to your statement saying, so raping and getting away with it is also a classist thing. Apparently so, Vandana Suri. And I want to take that question to Vikram Singh. Mr. Singh, is there a prejudice within the police force, within the law enforcers? Because you and I have actually had conversations on specific cases where there was a rape complaint or a girl has gone missing. The girl was invariably from a lower caste. The parents go to the police crying, saying their daughter has not come home. The police shoo them away and actually, you know, allow the perpetrator, tip off the perpetrator or the accused so he can get away and make himself scarce before any sort of FIR is filed. And this is invariably, as we dismantled it, we realized it had a caste or a class background to all of this. The system as well aids the rich, the powerful, and the upper caste against the poor and the lower caste. Is that the reason why Tara's observation of jails being filled with those with less access becomes true?
Well, there is something universal about Tara's observation in the sense that in US and UK, there are more Afro-Asians and of the minority community, even in the British prisons and in the UK prisons. In India, as Tara very rightly mentioned, but these statistics, I agree with the observations, but the conclusions, I have my own reservations. The conclusions are that those who are from the weaker sections of society are perhaps not able to defend themselves, get lawyers like Mr. Ashok, but they in fact defend themselves. And as you very rightly mentioned, show me the man and I'll show you the rules. We discussed the case of Kuldeep Singh Sengar, MLA. We discussed the rape case of Bangalore. On the show itself, they said that the survivor did not go to the police station, and white lie. And when we said, I'm prepared to be the complainant, they said, no, you cannot be the complainant. I would like to understand, why can anybody be not a complainant? The survivor says she is there, she wants to lodge a complaint. No complaint is lodged. I'm saying I'm prepared to be the complainant. You don't want to lodge my complaint. You very rightly mentioned that there was a specific section in the Indian Penal Code 166A of the IPC where a policeman does not register or does not do what he's expected to do in these sexual offenses. How many cases of 166A have we had in the country? That is a study which I would request Mr. Ashok to do. Barely, not even 0.5%. So do we feel we have some kind of a Ramaraj that all cases are being registered, all rapists are being vigorously pursued, all rapists are being punished? Certainly not. In a scale of 1 to 10, we have not been able to do even 1% of what was expected of the police to do. And therefore, it's a long run and a long haul before we say that a case is not registered, a case being registered, it is investigated in the manner in which Kuldeep Singh Sengar's case, he was addressed as Mananiya. In a home department briefing, he was addressed as, if a rapist is being addressed as Manani by the top bureaucrats, rest assured, the number 2 would say Param Pujya, number 3 would say Maha Mandaleshwar Shri Shri Ek Hazarat. Then the level of respect would go, and by the time he goes to the investigator would have a plate of cookies and a plate of cashews and a cup of tea for the, sir, what can I do for you? You tell me what to write and I will do the same. This is the ground reality, unfortunately, which we saw in case of not only Kuldeep Singh Sekar, but 1 or 2 other well-placed accused, not only in Uttar Pradesh, but all over the country. There are godmen in South India also, I'm forgetting the name, but who knows the floating Swami, who claims to be floating in the air, but he is accused of rape by no other than 5 women. And yet the police have not arrested him. That proves your point, Faye.
Absolutely, really well said. Ashok, like quite rightly pointed out by Mr. Singh, not everybody can afford a hotshot lawyer like you.
Yeah, so I mean, a critical failing of the system is that it has become very people dependent. So if you're lucky, you find the right police officer, you're lucky you find the right prosecutor. If you're lucky, you get enough media attention on your case, and then everything turns out right. And make no mistake, we have real good quality investigators in this country. I have seen some really excellent investigations, textbook collection of evidence, expeditious prosecutions. We have seen outcomes in less than 6 to 9 months in a lot of cases.
True.
But the problem is that it's not the average. And when we look at the efficiency of the system, we have to look at the average case. And if the average case is of that 94% statistics, which involves an acquaintance rape, there is efforts made to settle the case between the victim and the perpetrator. The prosecutor is probably disinterested or highly overworked. The policeman might be extremely zealous of completing his investigation on time, but the DNA report does not come out of the FSL in the due amount of time. So there are a lot of roadblocks that we are not being addressed. And on the subject of why there is such poor enforcement of Section 166A of the Indian Penal Code, looking at the US, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has something called as the Office of Professional Responsibility, whose only job is to investigate and examine claims of the FBI not doing its job correctly. Similarly, every police department has something called as the Department of Internal Affairs, which is an independent agency that is only investigating the investigators. So what it does is it builds multiple levels of accountability in the system. But today we have a situation where even if there is a complaint of Section 166A being lodged, ultimately it is a member of the very same fraternity and probably a batchmate from the very same academy who's coming and investigating the offense. So it's anybody's guess as to how impartial that will be. And at that point of time, the only answer is it becomes people dependent. If you have a person of integrity, you get good investigation. If there is no person of integrity, then God only knows where it goes. So yes, I think there is a disproportionate injustice being meted out to a lot of cases in this country. And to address that will not be done through changing the letter of the law. It requires lawmakers to really fundamentally revisit things like making the investigators independent, bringing in greater budgets for the police, ensuring greater accountability, and letting go of the need to control the police. And I think unless and until our lawmakers are willing to commit to this, and until we demand our lawmakers to do this, death penalty, castration, nothing will make a difference.
And so this is, and I know that Mr. Singh feels differently from what you do in terms of whether it's the death penalty or chemical castration or what the solution is. And I do want to ask Vikram Singh, how he feels about the actual valid deterrent at this point in his opinion. Mr. Singh?
Faye, my young friend, Mr. Ashok, is a youthful person, so optimistic and sees goodness everywhere. And he believes that unless a person proves otherwise, he should be taken as honest. In my training of 36 years in the police, I say, take every accused as dishonest unless he proves otherwise. There are a gang of criminals who operate during these monsoons, and it is a part of the modus operandi to commit rape also, apart from robbery. And if they are identified and accosted, they commit murders also. And during the course of my interrogation with these, they are known as Ghumantu tribesmen. The Ghumantu tribesmen said, what is the biggest deterrent that you will not commit rape? The biggest deterrent is registration of the case. And how do you identify that the case has been registered? वो नीली बत्ती वाली गाड़ी अगर आ गई 24 घंटे में तो मान लीजिए पुलिस आ गई, इसका मतलब केस लिख दिया गया. The second deterrent is that there is a convicting district judge, a district judge who convicts and sends you to the gallows. That is the second deterrent. And the biggest deterrent of all is you. In what way? कि पुलिस की मार और थाने की पिटाई is the third deterrent. Of course, that is totally illegal. Then the less discussed, the better. I would not go into that. But they say that a police officer who has a reputation of encounters, like the Hyderabad model, is also a big deterrent to rapists, which is the part of the modus operandi to commit rape during the course of the crime. The Hyderabad model, you may recall, when they were taken and recreate the scene of crime, they tried to snatch the weapon, allegedly tried to snatch the weapons, and in the melee, they were shot dead in the encounter. Of course, I do not agree with this episode. I have my own reservations about the story itself, but that's a different story altogether. But my interpretation that where I have tried to go behind the eyeballs and rewrite what Taraji had written, perhaps I tried in my own soul, like the silence of the lambs. How can I predict this kind of crime? How can I predict things going wrong? They said that the biggest deterrent is a firm police action of registration of a crime, a sound district judge who convicts, and the third, law taking its own course. The police beating and bashing, of course, is the other side, totally illegal, but it's a part of the subculture, and I cannot wish it away as of now.
Very well said. I want to ask Tara one question, and this one's come up as well from one of our audience members. Is there a need to educate people on rape? Did you find that a lot of women that you spoke to don't even know they've been raped, or a lot of people don't even acknowledge rape as a crime, or don't, I mean, even though we have the laws and the laws are very specific, it's not something that education has really done justice to. Tara?
I just also, before taking up your question, Faye, I just also want to go back and, relook at rape, not from a law and order approach. You see, this is my problem with rape reporting, that we're looking at rape and saying, we need to tighten the laws or enforcement and police reforms, and all of which I agree. But the question is, if you look at rape as, why do men rape? Because they want to and because they can. They can, of course, is addressed with the law. But why would you want to? If tomorrow someone came to me and said, I give you a free pass, you can go get away with murder, I'd probably say, hey, look, I don't really want to murder anyone. So a law and order approach doesn't really focus on the psychology or the culture or the causes. And unless we focus on the causes of rape, unless we understand the problem, we're not going to be able to solve it. So a law and order approach does deal with what happens post-rape, but I'm more concerned with pre-rape. Why was it done to begin with? Now, yes, of course, what you said, coming back then to what you said, Faye, yes, a huge problem that I found with the men that I studied was that there is no common understanding of rape and consent in the country, men or women. So women were possessions, women are now people. Rape was once considered bad because, honor and virginity and other patriarchal concepts. Now we look, it's come full circle, and rape is considered bad from a feminist and human point of view because it's a violation of the victim's human rights and bodily and sexual autonomy. So not only do men not understand what rape is, I've heard all sorts of statements. Rape cannot happen unless it's many men with a knife. I've heard, she will, now also from a romantic point of view, a woman is always expected to play hard to get. Now this is across cultures, right? Women are expected to play hard to get. Now, if a woman's no in a romantic point of view is just a matter of pushing her boundaries and eventually getting her to agree to be in a relationship with you, then rape then and her no is not taken seriously in a sexual context as well. there is also absolutely no understanding of marital rape, neither legally nor socially, because I've heard, shadi ke baad rape ka kaisa. It's just a matter of either convincing your wife that you have the right to have sex with her, whether or not, and I've heard whether or not she wants it, and I've heard a lot of men say, वो कह देती कि आप ही कर लो जी, which is, I don't want to do it, I don't want to have sex with you, but of course it's your right, you have a right over my body. So there isn't a lot of, and it was funny, but one of these groups that I'm on, and this is my little part of the feminist internet, and I'm on this group, and this is girl describing how she was forced by a best friend, etc. And I think at some point I wrote to her and said, and this is like a public conversation, and I said, look, you were raped. I don't think you know this, and I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's the definition of rape, being coerced and forced. So no, we do not have an idea of what is consent. We do not have an idea of what is rape. And how will we also, when, and a lot of the ideas that come to us are from religion and reinforced by religion. And I'm just going to go back to what Mr. Singh said, which is that how can you, where was Draupadi's consent, right? When you talk about her coming home, having married this one gentleman, and his mother saying, distribute the arms equally, and then she married 5 men. In the telling of the Ramayana, of the Mahabharata, do you ever hear of her statement about whether she wanted this or not? She also, in the popular telling of the tale, she's also angrier at the men who won her in that game of Chopad than she is with the people who bet her in the first place. So how do we have an idea of rape, right?
Yeah. So very well put, Tara, because it also had got some sense, and we've had enough of this, and I'm sure you've heard it as much as I have, about women who are in some way party to the patriarchy. But that's also because it's generations of hard coding, of the lack of self-worth, the idea that you are also property, the idea that you are also a physical custodian of the family honor. And so that idea gets passed on from generation to generation. So there's culturally and sociologically, there is a great deal of work to be done. I do want to ask the two gentlemen also in conclusion, Ashok, if you could tell us, if you were, to suggest one thing that you believe ought to be done immediately, would that be the study of psychology and criminology of those who rape?
Absolutely. I think I would also add one more thing to the mix, which is victimology. I think as important as it is to understand the minds of the perpetrators, we also need to understand the pattern of victims. Who are these people? For example, street children in this country are extremely vulnerable to sexual violence, but hardly any effort has been made to understand who these children are, why they tend to be more vulnerable. And in the US, the FBI always says to understand the perpetrator, you first understand the victim, right? And the more you understand the victim, the more you will realize who the perpetrator is. And they have done this study so well that today, based on just an analysis of the victim and the nature of the crime, they're able to reverse engineer the profile of the offender with an accuracy of 99.2%, which is a great tool to actually apprehend the suspect and to build a case against him. So I think we need to set up our own behavioral sciences unit. We need to get over the stigma of actually studying the offenders. We need to understand that these are people who are growing among us. They are creatures of the very same society that produce you and I. And unless and until we make an honest effort to engage with them, to understand who they are and why they do what they do, we will never truly be able to improve our law enforcement systems.
Really well said. Mr. Singh, do you agree that work that Tara Kaushal has done completely on her own and completely of her own initiative is something that we should look at institutionally in our country? Is the kind of work that we should be doing institutionally?
Faye, I have no doubt in my mind what Tara has done is a path-breaking piece of original research work. and I would comment that this kind of work should be undertaken by every police force. Getting behind the eyeball of the criminals is the prime responsibility of every police psychoanalyst. And this is the most neglected aspect of policing and criminology and victimology. I would also say that the cult of masculinity in the Khap panchayats in northern India, the cult of masculinity that pervades in the police department, the moment you enter an average police station of India, you find it is almost like a boys' club. And a woman complainant going there would almost feel totally alien, as if she's encroached upon the times of a boys' club. And they would say that a wife being battered, a woman being battered at home, saying that I've been battered by the husband. You know what the husband is known in Hindi. He's known as pati. The pati owns you, and if he's given you a couple of whacks across your face, it is his entitlement. This is not something that happened in the Roman age. This is something that happened a couple of years ago in a major town in Uttar Pradesh. Therefore, let us not have that shocked look, because there's a long way before we go in for a course correction. There are so many things that we need to do. Of course, my young friends Tara and Ashok are so idealistic, so very optimistic, and perhaps their recommendations I have not seen in any human history that something like that happened except in utopia. But lesser mortals like me are more concerned about victimology and also criminology. It is beyond the scope of average brains to go into the philosophical aspect of policing. It is only the grassroots and brass tacks of law, that faithful implementation and ruthless implementation of rule of law. The philosophical aspect shall be taken care of by brilliance of Mr. Ashok and Taraji and others. But for lesser mortals like me, faithful implementation of rule of law.
That's very well said. But I must point out, as a journalist myself, I have discovered that it takes equal measure of the idealistic and the realistic in order to get anything done. Because the hope that the idealist lends to any project, and the sort of hard grounding that the realist brings in, is the nice middle ground that we all need to get to where we are. I'm going to thank my panelists and wrap this up here, but just putting it in context to what we've heard so far, that while we've focused on perhaps just punishment in some way, we've created and built a system that is wholly inadequate. As Tara has pointed out, we haven't actually taken the time to talk to either victim or rapist to find out what's really going on in their minds. We haven't looked at rape not just from the crime point of view, but also the psychological point of view, why this happens and what they're thinking and what their motives are. As a result, it leaves our entire law enforcement and our understanding of prevention unarmed, unfortunately. As Ashok pointed out, a lot of the research, that the data that is available to us is from overseas. And while that is a good place to start, it's not adequate, because India is culturally different. And if you want to understand what's going on in India, let's also remember, with the advent of mobile phones and 4G and video, we're also changing very rapidly. So if we don't get a jump start on this, we'll get left behind, because we don't have a base on which we can build into this new world. And Mr. Vikram Singh pointing out that criminals are criminals, and that's always been his very clear stand. But of course, if we had a clearer idea or an understanding of motives, of what drives rapists, our investigators, our prosecutors, our judges would have a easier option, or maybe a slightly clearer path in the work that they have to do. This has been a fantastic conversation with all three of you. Thank you so much, and thank you to Open Talk for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to host this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you, Vikram Singh ji. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Faye. Bye.
Good luck, Tara. Congratulations.
Thank you.